All right, here's another one of my favorite types of podcasts. Just a long, interesting, rambly, philosophical, practical conversation with Glenn Murphy, whom, if you're a longtime listener to the podcast, you know very well. Martial arts instructor in the Sistema Russian tradition, stress-proof expert, science educator, author of multiple books on science, and all-around friend and great guy. And we talk about consolidation. We talk about what would you do if you knew you were going to die in a week? Would you keep doing the things you're doing? What would you do differently? And a whole host of issues related to coming out of the pandemic, hopefully, and living our best lives. Hope you really enjoy it. So without further ado.
Howie, how goes it, mate?
Very well, Glenn. Glad to see you again.
Yeah, it's been a wee while. I'm just trying to think. I think it's been a few months since we last had a recording. I've had a general bit of time off from the podcast in general, but also just us getting the chat.
Yeah, we cheated. We got together a couple of weeks ago and did not press record. So
yeah,
all those poor people who missed our conversation.
Yeah, there was some gold in there as well. I remember that bit where we solved, the meaning of life and everything, and that when the crisis in the Middle East. If only somebody had pushed the button.
Yeah, I can't remember a thing we said.
Nice. So today, I wanted to talk a little bit about consolidation. This is something that I think people tend to think about a little bit towards the end of the year. Either that, or they're just kind of limping their way to the end of the year, and they're just trying to kind of run out the clock on work and whatever responsibilities they've got going on until they can get to the end of the year. But recent events for me, particularly in suffering a family bereavement, and just sort of seeing how that focuses people, not only the person that's dying, but the people around them, on, wow, we've got to sort our stuff out, and we've got to refocus on what's really important, right? And that's often cited as the great gift of death, right? That if we were immortal, then we would just be bored all the time, and there wouldn't be any pressure or any urgency to do anything. And the very fact that life is finite and short makes it precious. That's exactly what makes it precious. Like a Japanese cherry blossom. You appreciate it. It's all the more beautiful because it's not hanging out for that long. Mm-hmm. I've come back from this experience and back into everyday life, and just realized the extent to which my life is disintegrated, and segregated. There's so many different threads, and that's partly as a result of, what I do for a living, that I've got a few different self-employed income threads and streams and roles and identities that way. But, on top of that, you're a parent, you're a friend, you're a husband. And sometimes I think we keep those things in more separated than we need to. We've got our work, and then what we think of as our family life. And then we talk about this work-life balance, and we have to keep them separate. But of course, work is contained within life, right? It's not a separate thing. And your relationships, sometimes I think we segregate out of the way that we interact with our family, and the way we interact with very close family, immediate nuclear family versus extended family. And then that from friends, and then that from, acquaintances or work colleagues or people that we interact with, and to our detriment sometimes, I think. And so I felt a great drive to consolidate things towards the end of the year, to not take on anything new to begin with. And then also to try and kind of take all these various open loops and threads and just close some off, not necessarily stop doing them. Some things, I think, stop doing them. But other things just kind of, can I wrap them more into a more unified whole, And if you look up the definition of consolidate, which I just did before I came in, to see kind of really how it's pinned down, you get kind of this dual sense. One of them is this idea of just uniting or merging, right? It's combining a number of different things and making one more coherent whole, right? And then there's another sense in that it's making something stronger or more solid, right? And to me, those two things are intimately related, right? When you can successfully unite things, not squared peg through round hole or jam things together that don't belong together, then you do tend to get a stronger and more solid result, right? And I was wondering if we could talk about the various aspects of our lives and how we segregate them, and how we can benefit from bringing things together and doing it now rather than waiting until you're a week from death to try and consolidate things.
Well, I might be a week from death. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the whole point, right? We don't know. So the first indication on this is just like, why wait? And especially, why wait until you're maybe sick or infirm or stressed out or, in debt in America increasingly, like in the run up to your own death, and stressed out by a bunch of other things to try and make important decisions about how you pull things together in your life. I mean, when we talk about, so if you imagine, right, if you did only have a week to live, right, let's try and do this, but not in a morbid way. Okay. Let's like, you had a week to live. You knew that it was going to be a week to live. There's no option. It's not treatable. There's no magic pill or miracle cure coming your way. Right. What kinds of things would you want to do, like, immediately with your next week yourself?
Yeah, it's funny. The first thing that came up was I would stop like cleaning the kitchen. And the second thing that came up was, no, I would keep cleaning the kitchen.
Why is that? Just to keep some sense of routine, or?
Because somebody's got to clean the kitchen.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, the first thing was like this feeling of I have no more responsibilities. Like, oh, I could go spend all my money. I could, max out all my credit cards. Right. But that's like, in a sense, like that's not how I would have wanted to live an extended period. It's almost like I've been thinking a lot about the philosopher John Rawls, who came up in the 70s with a theory of justice. And basically his philosophy of life was imagine a veil of ignorance, that you're going to be placed on this planet, but you don't know in what position. You don't know who or what you're going to be. Now come up with a system. And so it's almost like a veil of ignorance over my own mortality. Like maybe it's tomorrow, maybe it's in 50 years. Is there, I'm starting to think like, is there some sort of overriding value set that I would want to live by, as opposed to just sort of, okay, I've got a week short term, clearly I would, forgive people and ask for forgiveness and tell people that I love them and, probably eat that cake.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think a value set is a really interesting way of looking at it, right? It's like, with everything, I think, so eat the cake, right? So if you're thinking about diet and the way that people think about that, often it's deeply segregated. You have people counting their macros and their individual intakes. And I've done that glucose monitoring slap on pad thing, and people take on all kinds of different dietary philosophies involving lots of different individual steps of what they do. But ultimately the most sustainable one, and the one that, is in research is most reliably kind of backed up, is the diet that works is the one that's simple and sustainable in the long term, right? If it's more complicated than it needs to be, or it's more onerous or difficult for any reason, the psychological friction cost will mean that probably, unless you're just really, really like that sort of type A person who just likes to maintain routines for life, like despite yourself, that way, then probably you're going to give it up, and so it's as good as having no eating plan at all, right? So there's no point at all. Whereas if you do something very, very simple, like for my part, I tend to do the time restricted eating thing. So I'm just like, okay, eat within an 8-hour window. That's it. Right. Like, and there are perils to that. If you say, okay, eat whatever you want in that 8-hour window and stuff your face with processed foods and terrible fats and things like that, then you could get into trouble. But if I went the other way and tried to count every single thing that went in my face and just became so kind of obsessive about it, that it took up big reams of my day, and I've done that in the past, then I'll do that reliably for about 10 days, and then I'll bin it off entirely, and then regress to an all-day, dawn till dusk eating pattern where I'm like, no, I'm doing this to spite my, I'm doing this because I really don't want to spend my time measuring food and thinking about food and mindfully eating, like, sod you, sod everybody, he just starts cramming things into your face, almost to kind of, to rebel against that kind of idea. Whereas you can find a simple consolidated idea, like Michael Pollan's eat real food, not too much, mostly plants, or something like that, then that's probably it's better to have a consolidated philosophy of eating than it is a complex eating plan with 50 different steps. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think I want to see if there's some nuance in there that I want to come back to values, because I know people who eat in very complex ways that is sustainable to them because it's supported by their values. So for most people, we just want to eat, because eating is fun and it tastes good and we need to eat, and we don't want to make it the centerpiece of our lives. But I'll tell you, two groups of people who never break their diets are Orthodox Jews and vegans.
Okay.
And vegan, you can say, is very simple. Just don't eat, anything that came from a mother, right? Or has a face or whatever. But when you look at Orthodox Jews, there are tomes of debate about, what if you're having meat stew and a drop of milk fell into it, and what percentage and how many hours before. But it's because of driven by values. So I can imagine people who are really counting their macros and who can do it for decades, like someone like an Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's eating is part of my identity, is part of, the great person that I want to become. So I think the problem is maybe when the complexity overstrips the meaning it has in your life.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good parallel to draw there, I think. But to me, though, it's like there just seems to be a lot of anxiety and mental bandwidth dedicated to that, right? It's like even if the outcome of that eating is that you have a ripped six pack, or you feel virtuous in what you've done, or you've bodybuilded to become Mr. Universe or something like that. It's like what you had to go through to get there. I think of the actor Hugh Jackman when, people always ask these dumb questions when people do action movies, and they're like, what was it like? I bet your wife loved it when you got all ripped and you became Wolverine. And she's like, no, she hated it. She hates every time I do an X-Men movie because I have to eat a whole bunch of protein every day, and I drink protein shakes 3 times a day, and then I fart such a firestorm that she just can't sleep in the bedroom with me. Like, she's like, I hate it when you're Wolverine because it's just your farterine. That's it. It's like, and she can't wait until he's done with the whole thing so he can go back to eating like more, more normal foods and a less insane schedule. So, I think of that sometimes. It's like, okay, if the trade-off is worth it for you, but if your meaning in life has to be found in what you look like, do you know what I mean? Or even, and this might be a bit controversial, do you know what I mean? In your feeling virtuous yourself, right? If you desperately have to find virtue in not eating anything with a face, right? I mean, I know it can sound a little bit harsh, but it's like, if you have to go through all of those steps and you have to dedicate so much bandwidth to doing that, it's like, is it healthy though? Like, because it could, like you say, and that if it purely aligns with somebody's values and they're happy about those values and they're glad to do it, right? They're absolutely glad to do it. I think that's one thing. But if you're fretting and anxious so much about the possibility of a drop of, chicken broth coming into your, vegetable stew or whatever it's going to be. One of the angriest guys I ever met was a Canadian vegan who did Chinese traditional martial arts, and he was in Japan, and he was just livid all the time. Everywhere he went in Japan, he would try and order something vegetarian, and they would bring him like a Japanese nabe stew or something or the other, and he would be like, what does this have in this? And they're like, oh, it's vegetarian. And they're just like what? And be like, oh, potatoes, there's carrots, there's lotus root, and it's like pork broth. And he's like, pork broth? How is that vegetarian? And he just got the rage everywhere he went because they didn't seem, in their minds, they just couldn't get around an idea of like, well, the lumps of things in it are vegetables, right? Therefore, it's a vegetarian food. Like, who cares if you use some fat or some broth or something in there? And he was just always angry, like all the time. And I'm not saying he's like a core example, but I think he's an example of somebody who took it to such an extreme. What's that?
He's not a core example.
Yeah, I don't think Curtis is unique in that. I'll say that, but was unique. But so I think you're right in that. I think if you're happy and you're glad to live by those values, and you find a joy in living the way that you do, then you will go through extraordinary things in order to maintain those principles and things, right? But I think I'm talking about a slightly different thing. I'm talking about the drive to, if you're thinking about something like, if you're consolidating life towards the end of life, and you made a really, really good point about, you could just be like, all bets are off, bring the sheep over here and where's the heroin? Do you know what I mean? just like, I'm going to try everything weird that I've never tried in my entire life, right? But that's not how you want to be remembered, probably, and it's not how you'd want to kind of spend your last time. Most people would say, I want to spend time, making amends, apologizing, forgiving people, asking for forgiveness, all those kinds of things. It's like, so do that now, right? And to the point that's almost trite now. It's just like everybody kind of knows that. They don't act on it, but still they kind of know that that's what they would do or what people drive towards doing. But that sense of do it now, right? If you extrapolate it backwards from either diet or exercise or relationships or what you feel about politics, any of those things, right? There's just a phenomenon in people when you see them as they're close to death, or they understand that there's nothing else going on, when they just seem to relax into themselves. They drop all of the artifice, right? They drop all of the pretense and the things that they think they're angry about and that they believe in very, very deeply. And you find out who they actually are. And typically who they actually are is this radiant person that loves everybody, that forgives everybody for everything, that sees no point, right? Sees no point anymore in these arguments. And they become lovely, lovely people. And you're like, well, why couldn't we do that, a good 20 years earlier or 5 years earlier or 3 weeks earlier and that sort of stuff. And so I'm interested in that phenomenon, the phenomenon that makes us rage at each other on Facebook over gender, race, or being a Democrat, being a Republican, the phenomenon that makes us rage at each other about eating in different ways, exercising in different ways, the way that we treat each other differently based on, right. where we weigh ourselves up in terms of a family or a work situation or whatever it's going to be. It's my contention that people, when they realize their mortality and they realize there's nothing more to be done, they let go of all of those things and live in a very beautiful, authentic, honest way that actually brings them a lot more joy, right? So it's just like, how can we extrapolate that joy backwards by consolidating and realizing that a lot of the things that we think we're holding on to so deeply really don't matter as much as we think they do. Otherwise, we would care about them a week from death. We just would, right? And I would put it to you that maybe, a lot of vegans, this is a bad example, they probably will continue to eat vegan, in the week before death and be like, yeah, this is really important to me. But like some people who've been counting macros, right, all the time would probably stop counting fucking macros in the week before death and eat the cake. Well, that's the one thing that you said, right? So if it's not important to you then, why is it important to you now, right? And that's a question that's I think it's worth asking.
Yeah, well, it's just a few things come up for me. I'll just throw out some words. One is like basically, I don't really believe I'm going to die. Like I have no experience with that. So in a sense, what you're saying, and I've seen people, on their deathbeds who've become transcendent in that way, and they're like, oh, okay, I understand reality. Like you don't yet, and that's okay. Like, but at some level, it's simply acknowledging the truth, right? It's not some weird gymnastics, but so that being very unconsolidated and disintegrated and living a herky-jerky life is in some ways a function of not being face to face with the truth of our own mortality.
Yeah, I think so. But you've got against that the offset that, okay, let's say that you do have a realization of things like that, right? It could stem you into a positive direction. And, in that you start to forgive people, you let people off for small slights. You take things less personally because you're like, life is just too short for all of this. And, I don't know when my last interaction with this person is going to be, whether it's my daughter or my friend that I haven't seen for years, all right? And if this is the last thing that I say to them, it will be I can't imagine what I'm going to feel like on my deathbed. So just that edict alone would create a value system in which it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's somebody I met two people yesterday for the first time, and in person, face to face, right? In downtown Durham, doing all the mask thing and everything that we do. And I met them for the first time in connection with work projects, right? And talking to them about it. And I tried to go into those interactions, not being like, oh, hey, what can I get out of you? What do we need here? What's the agenda? What do we need to have done by the end of this meeting, right? But I just tried to go in as a human being, like, oh, hey, who are you? What do you care about? And I tried to make the experience of meeting them enjoyable for them and for me, and it changed the entire tone of the interactions. It's like both of these meetings went off great. And we talked about the things we needed to talk about, but we also left as if we were already friends. Do you know what I mean? And it was a very different kind of thing than what I'm used to when you have a work meeting. You're like, okay, let's go in. Let's not spend too much time prattling because we have to have an agenda and get it finished and do things, right? The modern kind of productivity thing. But we got it done but I also felt like I had a decent interaction with a human being. And then I came home and had tried to have the same kind of interaction with my son. Do you know what I mean? And I think that sometimes we overlook that and we try and kind of separate out, we classify or categorize people into different types of people, not just based on male or female or, race or cultural background or whatever it is, but we classify them in our heads as just like, this is the amount of effort or familiarity I'm prepared to put into this, right? This is the amount of empathy I'm prepared to offer and the amount of connection that I'm prepared to create, right? We pre-decide the boundaries of those relationships before we're even into them. And I think we do that at our great peril, because again, if you spend your whole life doing that, it's like counting your relationship macros. You're like, okay, I've only got space for about 20 grams of carb people because they burn up quickly and go away. They're really fun to hang out with, but they're a drain on my energy, And then I definitely need to get my vegetables. I need to hang out with my family like an exact number of times and just withstand the differences in political agenda at Thanksgiving or whatever I'm doing, and just kind of eat my greens and just do the thing that's necessary. And then some protein, but not too much protein. I need to, meet fun people that are beefy and crazy women and crazy dudes, but not too many, kind of this way. And we decide that's what it is, instead of just having a general philosophy on interacting with people that sort of says, hey, be cool. Interact with everybody as if this might be the last time you interact with them. You just don't know. And see what comes of that. See what grows from that interaction. Like getting back to Tyson Yonker-Porter's, in Sand Talk's principle of like greater than and less than. Like you go into every interaction like I'm no greater, no less than you. We're just coming into this completely level and flat. We don't know anything about each other. I'm not going to assume anything about your knowledge. We're just going to come in and start talking, and everything else will work its way out.
Yeah. So Tyson came to my mind as well. As we were talking, and I think something else that came for me was just the idea of scarcity. That if we live in a society, we live in a society in which generosity feels scarce, in which relationships feel scarce. So naturally, if that's the currency, you're going to want to conserve and say, well, this is a work meeting. I'm not going to give them any of my soul. What if, this person becomes needy? I don't have it. I'm going to look the other way when I'm stopped at the park at the traffic light and there's someone holding up a sign saying homeless, 2 kids at home, sick, please help. Right. Yeah. Like I don't have it because intimacy and care and compassion are in scarce supply. And of course, if everyone in society believes that, then it is.
Yeah.
Right. Like, this book I just read, The Extended Mind, by Annie Murphy Paul talks about the effect of nature or external environments on our minds, on our brains. And it talks about like an urban environment predisposes us to scarcity because there's so much going on and so many people, we feel like I've got to get it now. Whereas nature gives signals of patience and abundance. So it's almost like you're better able to withstand temptation, to wait, to not have to like, let's get this deal signed right away, but let's sort of luxuriate in the presence of each other.
That's really interesting. I hadn't considered that before, and that specific urban rural hanging out in nature divide. I mean, obviously there's a lot been said just about getting outside and seeing the wavelengths of green light bouncing off the chlorophyll filled leaves and like how that relaxes your brain, and like, amounts of sunlight per day, resetting your circadian rhythms, and even about fractal patterns in leaves and nature that you see that are natural, organic, repeating fractals that you won't see unless you have a very, very clever architect or something in an urban environment. Right. But I think sometimes I get a feeling that those results maybe are the result of the way that people frame the question. You've got a psychologist saying, what is it about nature that relaxes the shit out of people? And they're like, okay, let's try them with a fractal, right? And then let's measure their brain waves and see what's going on. Now let's try them with some green light and then let's measure the brain. But they've reduced the question already. They've narrowed it down to a very small number of separated, unconsolidated things, right? When there's bigger patterns there. And I'd never considered that idea that if you're in a concrete environment where you can't see any natural abundance, you can't see anything that might be mistaken for food, or like, that way, or it feels like kind of a big imposing series of structures, and there's nowhere to really shelter. You're very exposed. There's people around you all the time. There'd be nowhere to hide, right? Then like a new cat coming into a new house, you try and find a corner to hide in, right? You're trying to get in your apartment and just go there, and then you come out and scurry for food, and maybe prey on a few people, and then come back again. Whereas when you're hanging out in nature, surrounded, I'm looking out the window now of the place where I live outside of downtown Durham, and I'm just surrounded by pine and oak trees, and I can kid myself that I haven't got tons of neighbors around me because they're spaced out enough with lots of trees in between them, and it's deeply relaxing to me to be here because, and that's, to me, that's really interesting. I'm like, well, if there was somewhere I had to hide, I could. Right. Yeah. And if there was something I had to eat, then I could probably find it in amongst all these trees and the animals that live in them and things. Yeah, I hadn't really considered that. Because often I think we think the opposite way, right? There's this perception that if you're out in nature, it's nature red in tooth and claw. And if you're camping and you don't have all the right gear, you're like, oh, I'm so vulnerable. I could die of exposure, or I could fail to find something to eat. And people then come back from that and just seek the comforts of urban civilization and be like, oh, here's where I've got the fridge with all my food in it and everything. And they feel safer with that. But on some deeper level, we probably don't. We probably feel more anxious living in amongst this stuff and not knowing that we could go and grab something. Do you know what I mean? That we're still dependent on these food chains and shopping chains and things to deliver Amazon to our door, or deliver, supermarket deliveries to our door. And probably, especially now in the last couple of years of segregation and isolation caused by the pandemic, that's probably driven up even more.
Yeah, I used to live in North Jersey, so I'd go to New York City for fun, when I was a teenager in my 20s, and I used to think about like the hourly meter drop. Like if you spend time in New York, it's $15 an hour just to exist.
Yeah. Right.
Right. And so there's all this stuff, but it all belongs to somebody, and it's not yours.
Right.
And yet it doesn't take much for a person to kind of break that spell. Whether it's like this video I saw years ago of just like this Buddhist monk on the subway just laughing, and they're just like he's laughing and laughing and laughing, and pretty soon like the entire car is laughing and like looking at each other and smiling, and like all the walls came down. I just had a webinar 2 nights ago with a woman who she's in New York. And she missed her friend's birthday. It was a couple of years ago during the pandemic. She couldn't go see her. And so instead of making a card, she made a little hat out of pipe cleaners and wore it, took a picture and said, "This is for your birthday." And decided, the woman was like thrilled, like, "Oh, that's so sweet." And the person that gave this webinar is then like, "I'm going to make one of these every day, and I'm going to wear it 9 to 5. And she worked in corporate America. And she's been doing it for 900 days now. And she's meeting all these people are like this little weird, funny hat is kind of like a signal to approach. Like I'm approachable. I'm fun. I'm a human being. I'm not just, a transactional cog in some wheel. And it was just really
I'm not sure I would
story.
get that signal from a pipe cleaner hat, but that'd be right there with tinfoil hat for me. That would be nature's signal for do not touch.
Well, she's definitely repelling some and attracting others.
Right. Yeah.
But
so.
in terms of like signaling something safe and approachable.
That's interesting. That's So to kind of bring it onto a subject that's closer to the heart of many Systema for Life listeners, right? For the whole thing, I've gone through waves of this in my own practice in martial arts and training, right? Where there's so much that you can study in Systema, from breath work through structure, through natural movement, and then different degrees of awareness and relaxation and controlled tension. And it's easy even within those things to kind of segregate them out and to split things apart, right? And a lot has been said in the past about the dangers of trying to split Systema into component techniques, right? And some people have split off and tried to do that. They try and take what it is and they're like, okay, well, here's the biomechanic, here's how you crank a head, here's the hips, and here's what we do. And Vlad and Michael have said in the past, when you cut Systema into pieces, like you cut a living piece off of something and all you have is a piece, right? You just have a dead apple. You don't have a growing tree. and you immediately destroy it. Like the strength of Systema is in its wholeness. And so I've kind of found that as well. And usually through enforced things, like the past few months where I was away and I was forced to triage which aspects of my training I would continue under very difficult conditions and no time. Everything was dedicated to the care of someone else and just trying to keep work afloat and doing things like that. And so I just didn't have these reams of self-employed, self-directed time where I can move my own time blocks around and make up for things. Like if I miss breath work first thing in the morning, I can do it a couple of hours later, take a little break. If I miss my strength training or, my chance to hang out and do a couple of push-ups or something, I can always crank it out later on. But I was in a situation where I couldn't do that. And it wasn't flexible. And I was I was on call, for a long period of time. So I had to say, okay, what's the minimum? What do I do? And if you just segregate something out and say, okay, I'm just going to do some breath work, I'll do like 5 minutes of breath work and then get going with the day, or I'm going to do like some push-ups and then that will be it. Then you're obviously going to miss out on something, right? If you train strength to build your structure and you go walking or running with breathing to build your cardiovascular capacity, and you dedicate time to like opening and increasing your flexibility as 3 independent little things, then if you drop off flexibility and you just do a bunch of push-ups every day, you actually get worse than had you never done the flexibility or the push-ups in the first place. And if you don't go walking, if you just do the strength stuff and you don't walk and breathe or anything, then you'll get very strong, but these muscles will demand more oxygen, and then you're not building your cardiovascular capacity. And this happens to bodybuilders, I think, and stuff as well. And they just end up kind of wheezing. They're like mouth breathing all the time, trying to supply these muscles that need oxygen, but they're not increasing their heart or their vascular system's capacity to feed it. So something always gives, right? If you don't do that. So I found myself consolidating a lot more and being like, okay, how can I do one push-up that imbues all of these things? Like just get up and get into a push-up position and be like, okay, I'm meditating in my push-up position. I'm opening myself. I'm feeling my environment. I'm breathing to the very limits of my body and the environment around me. I'm aware of what's going on. And then I'm trying to do that push-up, maintaining openness, feeling where the mobility is and isn't in my body. And then after I finish that, maybe be like, okay, I'm going to breathe, stretch, and mindfully feel what needs to open up for a few minutes. And then that's it. Like, that's what I did. Like, I did one exercise that consolidated all of those things. And that was the best that I could hope for that day, and if the next day I had 10 minutes more, I would do a few more things. Right. But it just became a very efficient focusing process that forced me to be more mindful about everything that I was doing. And then I've come back from that thinking, after a layoff, after, pushing and pulling people or getting punched or punching people, I've come back after a couple of months like, oh, this is going to be terrible. Just the lag and what's happened here is going to be awful. It's going to take me a long time to find my feet again and get my chops and things. And while that's certainly true of a little bit of receiving impacts, right? That's just like a perishable skill. If you're not used to getting punched for a while, your nervous system just starts to flinch again, and you have to get hit a few times before your body remembers that you're fine, you're okay, and you don't need to protect yourself. But in most other ways, I found myself coming back into practice in a much more whole state. Like once I got over that initial hump, and the psychological kind of flinchiness a little bit, then everything that I was doing started to become more imbued with this wholeness, right? With this idea that I can't afford to switch off one of these things, right? Or I don't want to switch off one of these things because it's a waste of my time. It's a waste of my time wrestling somebody while I'm not breathing and maintaining an awareness of my mobility and things. Like if I'm just trying to wrestle to get somebody to the ground, but like I'm constricting and losing other things, I don't care if I won or not because I lost in the long term, So it's been an interesting kind of bottleneck for me, like in forcing me to consolidate in various different ways, and that's just one of them as it relates to Systema and physical movement.
Yeah, boy, this brings up so many thoughts for me. I mean, first of all, you're talking about constraints and how we tend to think of constraints as negatives, and there's a way of thinking about constraints that they're almost always, if not positives in disguise, at least doorways to new understandings, new levels of development. So when you were talking about what you can't do in Systema, I quickly just wrote down what I remember are the 4 principles of Systema, right? Which was like breath, posture, relaxation, and movement. Mm-hmm. And so you just, you described a holographic push-up, right, that contains all of those.
Yeah.
And then I'm also imagining that when you were a caregiver, you didn't turn those off, right?
Right.
And there are plenty of opportunities when life is giving you hard situations to stop breathing, to freeze, to slump, to be tense. And, so like the name of your podcast is Systema for Life. This is why you've trained. You didn't train Systema so that you could roll around and punch people on Wednesday nights. You trained Systema so you could be a human being in a very difficult situation, giving more than you would have been able to give had you not done this practice.
Yeah. Well, little column A and the little column B, I still do like rolling around punching people on a Wednesday night. I mean, that's in the mix. Right? But yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And in a very real sense, I'm not saying anything new at all, right? I'm not saying anything that Vlad or Michael haven't told us 50 times before, or Emmanuel Manolakakis, or Matt Hill in the UK, just these admonitions to imbue your life with Systema. But I think there can be, if you take that the wrong way, if you take that in an academic sense, and you end up kind of trying to maintain perfect posture and open and close doors with your feet, and do you know what I mean, go up and down stairs, like moving lightly, and just like you're trying to train all day long, I think that's a very different thing. I think you discover this kind of consolidation where you have to, right? So somebody can tell you all day long, and you can even make a conscious, directed effort to try and do things all day long that way. But until you have to, until there's some constraint-based learning happening, you just don't, right? It's not a motivation. It's not a priority for you, and you won't practice doing that reliably. You might do it again, like it's like counting your macros, or, doing something that you don't really want to do and just doing it for the sake of it. You might keep that up for like 10 days. You might be a super mindful posture guy for 10 days. And you might even wear a device that reminds you to stand up when, I've done that before and things like that. But ultimately, as soon as you take the device off or somebody's not looking, it's like, how do you behave when nobody's looking, right? Yeah. And the answer to that is habit, right? The habits, the actions that you habitually take over time eventually become habits that then become hard to get out of, whether they're bad ones or good ones. And my thesis on this one is that you won't form these kinds of habits until you have to, right? There's no reason why you have to maintain strength, physical or psychological, if you don't need it for anything. If you're just an information worker and you could do fine by slumping over a keyboard and just doing this all day long, then you don't have to be strong for anything. And for a lot of people, their motivation for maintaining strength or, poise or their physical appearance is because they want to attract somebody, right? They're like, I don't want to be unattractive. I don't want people to point and laugh at me because I'm ugly or, fat or whatever's going on. And I want to attract women or whatever it is, men or whoever it is. And then once, the standard kind of thing, you get married and you're attached, like, I'm going to stop trying, and everything happens. It's like, well, if you don't do that, what is motivating you? It's like, you could be like, well, I still owe it to my wife to stay, if not fully attractive, then at least, kind of presentable, like not just sit there with the Cheetos in the folds of my flab or something, all day long. So you do owe it to that person that you're with, like to still be, somebody that you want to be with. But also there's got to be something beyond that, right? There has to be something that drives the whole thing. For some other people, it's a health scare, and they're like, okay, I don't care about what I look like. I'm completely unattached to appearances. Very few people are. They say they are, but they'll say they're unattached to appearances, but then maybe the doctor telling them, you have to lose 100 pounds or you're going to die, right? That's the thing that turns them around and then takes them into Josh LaJourney territory, and they go from like 400 pounds to like ultra runner or something, right? But like, what can we do without having that? Do you know what I mean? If we haven't got this massive drive of sexual selection, and like if you're not 20 and desperately trying to impress the opposite sex or whoever you want to get together with, and if you're not, terminally ill and somebody's told you have to do something, right? What are the drivers that can make you take on good behaviors and do them anyway? Like in the absence of those things. And I think we're circling back to understanding your mortality. Not that you're going to die tomorrow and you have to do things to stay healthy, but like you are going to die at some point. You don't know when that is. So you might as well start living by these values now, so that you don't have to change everything at the last minute and regret everything at the last minute. You can just carry your way through your life, and whether it ends next week or it ends in 6 months or it ends in 60 years, you're fine, because it was all the same thing. You kind of created a timeless expanse out of your life in which it doesn't matter where you took the cross section. You were happy, you were contented, and you were living by your values at any point in that timeline. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. And I think the first word I wrote down when we started talking, I circled it 4 times, was obligation. And I wasn't quite sure what I meant, but I think I have a sense now that if you want to live a unified life, then you're the one who has to approve of yourself, right? But if we live a life of obligation, that we need approval of others, and in order to be okay, then every other that we meet has a different take, and we need to act in a different way. So I need to be different with my boss than my coworkers. I need to be different with my coworkers at 10:30 in the morning and 7 o'clock in the evening at the bar. I need to be different, for working out. I need to be tough. When I go dancing with my wife, I need to be accommodating, right? Like, and of course there's absolutely a good reason to adapt to situations. But I think it's a big difference if we're doing it because baseline we don't feel okay. And we don't feel safe unless others are approving of us. And we don't, so whatever referent group we're part of, we have to figure out what are the rules here. And so I think that, for me, the biggest liberation in my life, and it's coming pretty late, it's really accelerated in the last year, in fact, is fearing less the disapproval of others, being okay with criticism, being okay with conflict, and being in touch with, like, there is a self that I can discover and explore and appreciate and express that's different from the one who's trying to fit in one way or another. And sometimes
the one that's forced to perform and adapt and accommodate all the time.
Yeah. So when it becomes about the ego and self-image. So if the obligation, we were talking about macros and eating, if my obligation is to some external force that I've interjected as, well, I've got to be healthy, or I've got to be buff, or like I was working out this morning and I was really hot. So I took off my shirt and there's a mirror there, and I'm doing these like forward bending, like body rows with kettlebells. And I can see like my guts hanging down in the mirror. And I have this moment of like, boy, maybe I should do another 100 of these and skip meals for 4 days so it doesn't look like that. It's not terrible, but it was totally an ego thing. Like I want to look better. And there's absolutely good reason to not have belly fat when you're a man my age. And there's also, there's a voice in my head that disapproves of me. And can I be okay with that and not identify with it and not get jerked around by it?
Yeah, that's really good. And again, that brings us back to two of the themes. Again, if you're in the last couple of weeks of life, you give zero fucks about what anybody thinks about you. Do you know what I mean? Like, apart from that, you want to do right by people, right? You don't suddenly become image conscious. Like, all of that goes out the window. It's just a big humbling process, right? And systemic practice, like that's the focal point, isn't it? Like, know thyself, not know thyself and then be awesome and type A, make yourself better and be bigger and compete and beat everybody else. It's like, understand your weaknesses and your ego and how they're getting in the way and how that's creating artifice and tension and conflict when you meet with other people, because you're trying to adapt to them, or you're trying to oppose them, or you're trying to do things when all you really need to do is understand who you are, and then just be open to what's happening in the moment. And that's what actually allows you to connect with somebody on a deeper level, and to diffuse a conflict, to move when they're moving and take them down without them really feeling it that very much. It's what allows you to make contact, with a fist without it feeling like it was like an insult. Like when Vladimir or Michael hits you, it doesn't feel like an insult. It doesn't feel like they were being mean. It just feels like they were showing you something. They're like, there it is, look. And you're like, oh yeah, there it is. And you sit down and you're like, I don't know why I didn't think of that before. So it's a lesson. Every interaction with them is like a lesson. And I think that's what I knew this again. Like, I doubt there's anything in 140 episodes of this podcast that hasn't been said before by somebody a lot smarter and a lot more experienced than I am. So this, in a lot of ways, this podcast and conversations, specifically with regard to Systema, is usually a slow process of me realizing how stupid I am and how resistant to change, and how many times people have told me these things, and then I don't learn them until I need to, right? Until there's some massive imperative for me to learn them. And then other people talk to me and they're like, I just learned this thing, and I'm like, yeah, oh, bless your heart, bless your cotton socks. It's taken you a long time to learn that. But then I'm like, yeah, well, they didn't need to learn it yet. They're still kind of puzzling away in the early ego-based stages of training, and they haven't figured out that doesn't matter yet. You know what I mean? And so everybody's kind of on a level with this. But again, it's very easy to get into this and then start to compare and just think about where you are, even in the sense of like, oh, I'm more evolved or more transcendent than you are. Like you've got things to learn. It's like, no, like again, that's going to be a root of conflict on what's going on. Even if you think you understand something, you should still drop back, look at what you're doing, and be like, am I taking on a role now? Am I taking on the role of teacher guy? Am I taking on the role of enlightened coach who's going to teach you how to live your life? Am I taking on the role of author? I should be knowledgeable about this stuff because I write books, or where it's going to be. And then you start to just play a part instead of genuinely being with the person in front of you, not trying to assess what it is they want or trying to anticipate what they want to hear, but just being there and being like, yeah, and we're just two people, and I'm going to be empathetic to what's going on. I'm not going to pretend to be anything I'm not, and hopefully you won't either. And then you get these fruitful yarns, right? You get these fruitful kind of things that grow things that weren't there. They weren't in me. They weren't in you. They just kind of emerged from the conversation.
Yeah, I'm part of a Facebook group that's mostly made up of therapists. It's it's around a modality called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy.
Yeah, I've heard
and I'm one of the only coaches, and so there's a lot of technique in ACT, and a lot of exercises. And so one of the younger, less experienced therapists was asking about, and one of the more experienced ones said, like, yeah, we've got all this technique, but at the end of the day, if you want to be a good therapist, you've got to be a mountain climber. Like you have to respect the mountain in front of you and be totally present. And you don't impose technique on the mountain. The mountain teaches you which technique. And I've experienced that as well on the mat.
Yeah.
Right? Like
literally with mountain-sized people sometimes.
Yeah. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just, get hit and, take the blow. Like there was no blocking that one. There was no counterattack. There was me getting beat up in a way that like, oh, thank you for teaching me that.
Yeah. There was an interesting piece of advice I got from Emmanuel Manolakakis once when I was at his place training, and I was doing quite well with people my size. And then he had a couple of bruisers were in there, a couple of larger guys that I was training with. And immediately the quality of my work changed, right? I seemed to get irritable and I wasn't, not only was I not succeeding as much, but I was also just looking foolish doing it. It was obvious that I was getting irate, with the whole thing. And it just looked like a whole series of stalemates. It wasn't that I was getting beaten up. My movement was becoming obvious and stiff, and everything that I was doing just looked like it was easily countered. And he just said to me, "It's like the first thing you have to do when you go up against somebody who's bigger than you is forgive them for being bigger than you. It's just like, it's not their fault. They can't help it if they're like twice your weight and all your strength. Like they might be gloating about it. They might be smug about the fact they're enormous and they, like a bouncer at a club. And that's probably who you're thinking of when you're failing to do anything to somebody who's big. But he might not. He might be a perfectly nice guy who just is trapped in this enormous, strong body. He can't help it. And he's working with, and you're annoyed at him for being bigger than you genetically. It's like he didn't ask for that. So I'm like, oh, okay. And he goes, yeah. First thing you have to do is forgive them for being bigger than you. See them as who they are, and then you can start to work. You work with what you've got, and what you do. And again, I took that on a very small level. I'm like, okay, file that on how to beat up big guys, right? And and that was just where I put it in my brain. But like, there's a much bigger lesson in that. It's whether somebody's got more money than you, they're more enlightened than you, they're more knowledgeable than you, or whatever it is. Forgive them for it first. Be like, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I don't need to be jealous or angry about it. I just need to acknowledge who you are and who I am, and then we just get on with it, and then maybe we can find some common ground, but almost by accident as it goes in.
Oh, I love that. There's so many people in my life I need to forgive now.
Yeah, exactly. Again, what's the motivation? Not yet. We'll see. We'll see. I'm sure it will come. Well, thanks, man. That seems like as good a place as any to wrap on it. Any final words or any final thoughts on consolidation? Can we consolidate too much? That's one thing I want to kind of get to, because we can definitely try and be too efficient, right? We can definitely try and cram too much into a day or do too many things at once, and then it just turns into multitasking. But where does consolidation become counterproductive, do you think?
Well, I think when it becomes the goal. Like the goal isn't consolidation. The goal of systema isn't systema. The goal of religion isn't the religion. I think there's a line, I can't remember where it's from. It's like, don't confuse the finger that's pointing with the moon that it's pointing to.
I think that's from Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, but he probably nicked it from early Confucian philosophy, but I remember it from Enter the Dragon. Don't confuse the finger, or you miss all that heavenly glory. That's my best Bruce Lee impression.
Yeah, cool. I mean, that when it becomes, that consolidation isn't the goal, right? That it's the goal is, a well-lived life by the values that you hold dear, whatever those happen to be, courage, compassion, kindness,
strength, humility, all the usual stuff. Yeah.
But my last thought, which is when you're talking about like the 1 week to live, and people at that point, don't give a fuck. And there's a researcher, Kelly Turner, who wrote a book called Radical Recovery. And she's not a medical person. She's basically an anthropologist, and just found all these stories of people who made remarkable recoveries that they shouldn't have made according to Western science. And she just talked to them and basically just asked, what did you do? And one of the things that there was only two things related to like physicality, so food and exercise. Everything else was, sort of mental, emotional, spiritual to some extent. Yeah. And one of the things that they decided they basically stopped listening to other people's advice, not in a bad way, but not in a I'm smarter than them way, but like, I'm going to pay attention to me and what makes me happy, like as we were talking about. And so a lot of them did that with months to live and lived for years. Like there's something I think that is life stealing about giving your life force to other people. Yeah. And something very healing about consolidating it with, under your own management.
Right on. Well put. I'll put, you can send me a link to that book and I'll put it in the show notes. Along with another one that I've been reading since last month, called The 5 Invitations by Frank Ostrozecki, I think his name is, who runs a Zen hospice in California. And it's just all about the lessons he's learned watching and helping people die, and the patterns that people go through, and, what can we learn from this and apply right now instead of, waiting until you're in the hospice kind of thing. So that sounds fascinating. I'll definitely look one up.
All right. I'll check out 5 Invitations. That sounds great.
Grand. Well, thanks so much, Howie. Hope to see you in person. Hopefully Omicron doesn't steal our capacity for getting together again and lock down the entire world again as we go into the new year. But I'll look forward to more chats into 2022.
Yeah, me too. Thanks. And show notes, such as they are, at plantyourself.com/506. I'm recording this in advance because I got a bunch of things coming on. So if you listen to last week's episode, same movement news, same garden news, and let's get into the thanks, and I will see you again next week.